So this video, I give an overview of the key readings for topic 5, which examines the question of whether and how people internalise inequality. And we've got Pyke looking at internalized racial oppression or internalized racism, and Shildrick and McDonald looking at the internalized notion of stigmatized understandings of poverty amongst the poor in poverty talk. So why are these the key readings for the topic? We'll both look at how ideologies which justify inequality can come to be accepted, to some degree at least, or internalised, as this topic frames it, by people at the bottom of social hierarchies. So it's really the question of how subordinate groups come to accept some of the ideas which justify their own subordinate position. Pyke examines this in relationship to racial inequality, exploring what she terms internalized racial oppression, or the hidden injuries of racism, in which people of colour internalise the stigma of racism. Shildrick and McDonald examine the hidden injuries of poverty, looking at how ideologies which justify class inequality and see people living in poverty as somehow inferior groups are accepted by people who are themselves living in poverty. So their study of poor people living in severe hardship, for example, found that they denied that they were poor, was doubtful there was real poverty in Britain, and when they did identify other groups as being poor in Britain, saw them as essentially undeserving scroungers, which Shildrick and McDonald connect to the stigma, the wider public stigma, to being seen as poor. And I think both Pyke and Shildrick and McDonald show the complicated nature of internalisation. It does happen, but there are also some significant qualifications to this process. So let's first think about Pyke's examination of internalised racial oppression. What does she mean by that term? And she firstly draws on Stuart Hall's definition, in which internalised racial oppression is, as he terms it, the subjection of the victims of racism to the mystifications of the very racist ideology which imprison and define them. So that's where people of colour come to accept at least some beliefs which position people of colour as inferior. Now, Pyke argues that all systems of inequality are maintained and reproduced in part through their internalisation by the oppressed. Now, she says that various terms have been used to discuss this in the literature, such as internalised racial oppression, internalised racism, internalised white supremacy, the notion that white people are somehow inherently superior, and what she terms she very much doesn't like, racial self-hatred. Pyke focuses on internalised racism, but she's very careful to distinguish it from victim blaming, arguing that it's not the consequence of any weakness, ignorance, inferiority, defect, gullibility, or other shortcoming of the oppressed. And that's because she argues for what she calls a sociological resketching of what has largely been a psychological concept. She says there's too much danger in focusing on the so-called black psyche. If we do that, she says, the larger problem of white racism seems to disappear, resulting in inner blaming the victim perspective. And she says many scholars of racism haven't explored internalised racial oppression for this reason. And they've been much more focused on how dominated groups resist their oppression and stigma. And Pyke says, yes, we should focus on that, but she says if we only focus on resistance, we risk forgetting what oppressors and systems of oppression do to the oppressed, the damage it causes to people. And she argues that white privilege is dependent upon the successful transmission of ideologies of superiority and the inferiority of non-whites to all members of society, including racially subjugated groups. She's largely writing in the context of American studies of this, although I think she thinks it applies more generally. So, internalised racial oppression. Pyke argues that if we keep a focus on the social, structural and cultural mechanisms of domination that lead to the internalisation of racism among oppressed groups, we can have a better understanding of how domination works. And she draws upon Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony, which we've been exploring in lectures, to analyse internalised racial oppression. She says it's part of the process by which the ruling race, the white race, attains the consent of subordinated groups. She argues that it is the need to negotiate their subordination and the supremacy of white people that produces internalised racial oppression, because people of colour cannot avoid the negative stereotypes which construct them as inferior in popular culture. She argues that negative stereotypes about people of colour circulate as taken for granted knowledge in popular culture. And she says that people of colour attempt to defend themselves against this. There are two defensive responses to such negative stereotypes: assimilation and defensive othering. So assimilation is attempting to fit in with the dominant racial group, and that may occur through people adopting kind of what white cultures, mannerisms, lifestyle preferences, and so on, by appearing more white culturally. Defensive othering, well, what's that? That's when people attempt to deflect stigmatising labels about their social group, about them, by arguing that the label is true for other members of their social category, but not for them personally. And she says defensive othering is an example of the internalisation of racial oppression. Now, she says it's understandable why people do this. She says it's a normal adaptive response to racism. But she says when subordinate groups use defensive othering to resist being seen negatively, they do so in a manner that contributes to the reproduction of inequality, because it helps to perpetuate those negative stereotypes. So we can also see this type of defensive othering in relationship to the stigma of class inequalities and poverty. And we can take that up in the next reading, which is by Shildrick and McDonald. So Shildrick and McDonald examine what they call poverty talk, which is when poor people talk about questions of poverty, and they seek to explain a paradoxical finding, namely that people who are poor themselves deny poverty and also morally condemn this group they term the poor, blaming the poor for their poverty. So despite their own experience of hardship, Shildrick and McDonald's informants were not willing to use the language of poverty to describe their own circumstances. They wanted to push the label of being poor away from themselves. Several found it difficult to even agree that poverty existed in Britain. Instead, their informants normalised their hardship by describing their situation using terms like hard up, or things being tight, while simultaneously emphasising their ability to get by and cope. So they say that, this is a quote, at the same time as describing difficult, sometimes traumatic circumstances, the people in the study were keen to stress the normality of their lives and position themselves as being in the same situation as others locally, in effect normalising their hardship. When the sample did identify people who were seen as the poor, they engaged in defensive othering. Those groups were identified as the undeserving poor, defined by their inability to manage or cope, and by not being respectable. So poverty became seen as the result of people's lack of respectability and their inability to manage, a moral failure worthy of blame. And of course, people who were poor themselves didn't want to be seen in those terms. Now, Shildrick and McDonald see four overlapping explanations of why poor people talk about poverty in this fashion. And I should add that it's not only Shildrick and McDonald's study that's found this phenomenon. We can see it in other studies as well. So what are their four explanations? Well, firstly, and this is an explanation we've seen before in accounts on this course, the restricted viewpoints of poor people. Secondly, there was the avoidance of the stigma of poverty, pushing it away, as well as the avoidance of the stigma of being working class as well. And then finally, Shildrick and McDonald argued there was a lack of working class institutions or counter narratives in the communities that these people lived that might challenge hegemonic views of poverty. So the kind of restricted reference group argument, the fact that people in the study mainly compared themselves to people in their own neighbourhoods, which were poor neighbourhoods, led to a diminished sense of relative deprivation and relative poverty. But it's also argued that poverty reflects the long-run shame and stigma associated with poverty and unemployment, in which people are blamed, seen as the fault of their own inactions, poor choices, and so on. And also, it was also linked to negative views of the working class. The people in the study couldn't draw on positive stereotypes about being working class, so they didn't want to draw on this label, and they did distance themselves from being working class as well as from being poor. But also, Shildrick and McDonald argue that in the deprived community they studied, working class institutions such as trade unions or working men's clubs, social clubs and so on had declined. So working class life had become less collective and solidaristic. And they link the absence of oppositional viewpoints on poverty, structural explanations of poverty as opposed to individual explanations of poverty, to the decline in working class institutions and solidaristic practices in the communities that they studied. That they suggest limited more structural understandings of poverty or collective responses to it. They said under those circumstances, it was harder to draw on counter-narratives about class inequality, which meant that ruling ideas that blamed the poor for their poverty came to dominate even amongst the poor themselves. So where alternative rhetorics or discourses about poverty are not readily to hand, ruling ideas take hold more easily. So here they're drawing on a kind of Gramscian notion of hegemony, arguing that it is not hard to read a hegemonic domination in the accounts. Alternative oppositional viewpoints on poverty and its causes were all but absent. Ruling ideas, which blame the poor, dominated. But interesting, so I mean both Pyke and Shildrick and McDonald draw on Gramscian notions of hegemony here. But Shildrick and McDonald also see this as a qualified process. So Shildrick and McDonald found that individualised, heavily ideological accounts of poverty are prominent amongst poor people, while a sense of class solidarity or structural explanation was much rarer. And they connect this to the decline in working class institutions such as trade unions. But they also point to a surprising they also point to a surprising finding in their study about the question of self-blame. They say, surprisingly, given the power of neoliberalism to project onto individuals a sense of responsibility for their own fate, self-blame was not a feature of the interviews. So their sample used individualising theories, which do blame people for their own poverty, to explain other people's reliance on the welfare system, but they recognised the structural factors affecting their own situation. Now that suggests the internalisation of inequality is a complicated process. Individualised explanations of poverty do shape the language of people experiencing poverty, but they could also see in the interview that those explanations were also actively resisted and rejected in relationship to their own situation. When explaining their own situation, welfare claimants in the study tended to blame social structure or the deficiencies of the welfare system, not their own choices. So there's internalisation of the stigma of poverty, but qualified internalisation in this study, and in fact in other studies which look at other groups of poor people. So, two related accounts. To reflect on those accounts, and to relate it to sort of previous sessions on this unit, do you think Pyke and Shildrick and McDonald's article support a thick theory of internalisation, a thinner theory, or some mix? I'm using Scott's distinction between thick and thin theories depending on their degree of ideological incorporation of dominant values. Also, how do the arguments in Pyke's article relate to the arguments made by Shildrick and McDonald? Shildrick and McDonald identify 4 factors shaping internalisation. Does Pyke refer to similar factors, do you think? And then on the basis of these two accounts, do you think the internalisation of inequality works broadly the same or differently for racial versus class inequalities? And then finally, how do both sets of authors think that the politicisation of inequality and the role of institutions shape the extent to which subordinate groups internalise their inequality? And we'll discuss those in the workshop.